All right, we're going to do, the plan is to make it through Esther and Job tonight, and for the first time in about, I don't know, it seems like 5 or 6 weeks, these are not one book. That are just separate books on a scroll. We've had that with Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, so I guess it's been 4 weeks in a row that the 2 books we covered are actually one book originally, and split into 2. These are 2 distinct books, and 2 distinct messages, completely different in how they're presented, how they come about. So they're just 2 of the most unique books in the Old Testament. So we'll jump right into Esther. It is interesting. Esther is one of the books that's questioned, and we will run into this a lot in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we're going to run into a lot of letters, whether they should be in the Bible or not a lot, but quite a few, of whether they should be in the canon or not. You really don't have that as much in the Old Testament. But the book that gets questioned about whether it should be in the Old Testament the most is Esther. The Dead Sea Scrolls that were found had fragments of every Old Testament book in there, except Esther. It also never mentions the name of God. But now clearly there is divine intervention. And the Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jews celebrate the Feast of Purim. And this is the origin of the Feast of Purim. And so it would make sense that it would be in the canon. So, but those are a couple of reasons why people aren't sure if it should have been in the canon. It is interesting, I thought it interesting that Esther's Hebrew name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle. And then her Persian name is Esther, which is the one we go by, which means star. The author is anonymous. Some people believe that it might have been Mordecai, but there's no real indication of that. There's no real good evidence of that. There's some early tradition about it, but not a lot there. Written somewhere, again, big range, 450, 400. If you remember the chart from last week, we had a chart that kind of mapped out you had the first return of the Jews after the exile, then you had Esther happen, where they defended themselves, and then you had the second return where you get to Ezra and Nehemiah. So this chronologically would have taken place prior to Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah going back the second time. The Jews of the diaspora, that is always just a reference to Jews that are spread out around the world. It comes, Book of Hebrews is written to the diaspora. That's written to Jews that are spread out around the world because of persecution or just around the world. And here it's those that were spread out because of the exile. Key word is fast or fasting. Key verse is Esther 4. Now this again is Townsend and Heinsohn. Most people, when they think of book of Esther, think of the Bible verse that says, perhaps you were here for just a time as this. That's probably, I would argue, the most famous verse. But they say the key one is this: go and assemble all the Jews and fast for me. After that I will go to the king. If I perish, I perish. Keep in mind, what's going on is Haman is declared basically war on the Jews. He's got a decree written that means all the Jews are going to be annihilated on a certain day. He uses a dice to determine what that day is, and the word for dice and die is pure, and that's where the Feast of Purim comes. It's kind of mocking Haman for doing that. But anyway, so there's the Jews are supposed to all die. So Esther's a Jew, so it means technically she's supposed to die, but they don't know that she's Hebrew. So she's going to go before the king and make a request that he takes away the punishment or the edict. And it's kind of interesting. We'll see how they worked around that. But she knew that if she goes into the king's presence without being asked, and he's not in the mood to see her, it's punishable by death. Now, if you remember how Esther got to be queen, was because he was having this big 180-day long feast. That's a long feast, by the way. 180-day long, over 180-day feast. And what he said was the end. He called Queen Vashti in, and she wouldn't come. And so they basically had a beauty pageant over the course of a year. And Esther was the one that was deemed to be the one worthy to be the queen after all of that. So that's what she's doing. She's going to make that appeal to the king. So she goes, fast for me. It's serious. Making sure we're taking the event seriously. But after that, I'll go to the king, and if I perish, then I perish. I did do they had another good chart in their book of a timeline, so I went ahead and included a timeline of that. I'm not going to read all those, but it just kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that are going on politically and within the Jewish life and when this would have happened. And so it's in there. First 5 chapters of the book deal with the danger that's set up to the Jews in the last last 5 chapters are about how they are saved. So it's a pretty simple outline, and people subdivide it a little bit different in places, but essentially it is clearly 2 halves of the book. So that's kind of the stuff from Towns and Heinsohn. When we look at the Finn and Stewart book, I like their specific advice for reading the book. 2 key things. The first one's literary. Look for humor. And I just like that because the Bible is a literary work, and God has humor. We have humor because we're made in whose image? God's. And so the idea that there's not humor in the Bible is overly naive. And Esther is one of those books that just has some interesting humor all the way through it. And the other part of that, a lot of that humor comes through in the place of irony, but there is also a lot of irony. Haman has the thing built so that Mordecai can be killed, and then he ends up being killed on it, and Mordecai is the one that's made a hero. So there's just a lot of irony throughout the book. One of the devices that the author uses going through for that. So the first one's literary, the second is religious. And again, we talk about God's hand. God's not directly mentioned, but this idea that Vashti doesn't appear, so she's deposed, and then of all the women that came together, the one that was selected just happened to be Esther, who just happened to be Jewish. God's hands at work in every part of the story. And Xerxes, he really isn't a great king. He gets talked into a lot of stuff, right? That's what happens throughout the book. He just gets talked into a bunch of different stuff. And even the idea of bringing Vashti at the beginning, he's just drunk and wants to see her. And wants to show off how pretty she is to all the dudes that are hanging out with him. And so he's pretty random. And so he really is just kind of a fool. And if you made a movie out of this, he'd just be the goofy guy. But again, God's sovereignty in the middle of all that is seen throughout the book. And so the second part that's religious are the actions of Mordecai and Esther. And I thought the question that they mentioned was interesting. Who constitutes the true remnant of people of God, and thus is in the genuine continual of the past? And so again, we see that continual. Who are the people that follow him? Oh, sorry, then Ezra and Nehemiah. That's left in from last week. Don't pay attention to that. Okay, a couple other. I thought this was fascinating. I ain't never seen this before. I've read through, taught through Esther a couple times, but I really thought it was interesting. The parallels that they point out from 1 Samuel 15. So if we look back real quick at 1 Samuel 15. It's when Saul was rejected as a king because he offers a sacrifice that he wasn't supposed to. And so that's part of there were 2 things in a row that he did that got him rejected, but that was the second. He was offered a sacrifice he wasn't supposed to. So similarities with that. Haman is called an Agagite. And an Agagite is linked to the Amalekite king that's in the story in verse 15. So there's a link there. And then Mordecai, like Saul, was a Benjamite, and both came from the line of Kish, but they were different Kishes. But there's that parallel of the name and how they show up. And authors do this, assuming the reader knows, he makes these connections to help drive home specific points within it. So that's one of the things to just observe as you're going through the book. And then the narratives in chapters 8 through 10 is like Joshua 9, specifically Joshua 9 and 9 verse 2. It says no one could stand against Joshua. And that basically is Mordecai at the end. Mordecai goes from being just kind of obscure, just somebody in there, to being somebody that nobody could go against him. And it's also a continuation of the Holy War, where consistently what we see throughout the Bible are people that want to get rid of the Jews and want to try to have the Jews annihilated. And so the story of Esther kind of continues that, but the victory, God protecting them, is continued from there. Now, I'm going to stop there because I really want to get to what Curly and Philip say about it in that same vein, because I'd never heard this before and thought it was interesting. And that's the audience. We talked about the dispersing, right? The people that were exiled. But notice what it says. The book also helps to prepare people for a time that God does not directly speak. In Esther, as all this is going on and the people are coming under attack, and it looks like Haman wins the first part of the book, and all the Jews are going to be destroyed. They pick the date, all the Jews are going to die on this day. And yet, God's hand is there to protect them, even though His name is not mentioned. And this book is written, if you notice the dates that we talked about, 400 BC. Well, the 400 years before Christ, God didn't speak through any prophets. And so the people are about to go through a long period of time where God's not speaking to them. But you can read the book of Esther and remember what? Even when I'm not hearing directly from God, I know that He's faithful to His promises. I know that He protects His people. So it's really interesting that one of the impacts that Esther has is with that. Now the themes that they point out are situational irony. Again, the action effect the effect of the action are just not what you would think it was going to be or what was intended by the people in the book. And then the ethnic divisions. Again, Haman as an Agagite, he's from the line of Esau. And then Esau's line is finally going to be destroyed. God had said that they would eventually be eliminated in history in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and actually I'm pretty sure it's one of the prophets also talks about that. I can't remember the minor prophets, I forget which one that is. Purposes gives the origin of Purim, and God is at work. Now see, I never liked, number one, I wrote these down because this is what they say in the book. But if a student of mine had written that, I would mark them down for that. I'll have to tell those guys that sometime, Rodney. Anyway, because I would argue that every major purpose of a book and of a passage is always about God. It can have secondary implications about people, but when you read a story, it's about God. In fact, it's interesting, one of the assignments, in fact, I had graded last week, book out of the passage out of Acts, our students had to give the interpretation of the passage. And one of the comments I make on about half the papers is your theme of the passage, your principle, is about what man should do, not a moral of the story. Or you're giving me a moral of the story. It's never a moral of the story. The purpose of every passage is about God. So even like David versus Goliath, the story, the principle that we're to learn there is not David had faith in God and therefore he succeeded. No, that's the application of the principle. The principle is that God was continuing to protect His people, and He let a little shepherd boy kill a huge giant is the way He demonstrated that. But the principle is always about God and what's eternal that we learn about God. So, I listed two. I prefer the second one. God's at work in unseen ways and nothing falls outside His sovereign control. Because that is absolutely the principle of this book. It's absolutely true. Nothing is outside God's sovereign control. Everything is under His auspices. All right. Theological issue. I thought this was the text of Esther. I did not. And this is probably another argument you can make why some people would not want this in the canon. So the Septuagint, which we've talked about, the Greek version that was written of the Old Testament, is more than 100 verses longer than the Hebrew text. Now that's in the New Testament, because there are so many different documents that we have. There's what they call textual variants, and they tend to fall into groups. But you know what those text variants are. If you read your footnotes close in the Bible, study Bibles, it'll tell you what those textual variants are. And so we're able to determine what those are. It doesn't go against the authenticity of the Bible or the accuracy of the Bible. It just lets you know it's written down by humans. And that's just kind of something you have to deal with. You don't have as much. In fact, Mark's always the example I go to, because I think it's the last 9 to 12 verses in Mark aren't in a lot of in the older documents. They're in later ones. And so a lot of people don't think the last part of Mark should be there. And so that's one of the biggest ones. Well, this has kind of got the same thing. There are over 100 verses that are in the Septuagint that aren't in the Hebrew text. And they are left out of the English text, so the English text goes back to the Hebrew. But those are normally apocryphal editions. And so apocryphal, again, refers to the period of time between that 400 years where God doesn't speak. If you ever noticed a Catholic Bible, it's going to have books that we don't have in the traditional Protestant Bible, and those are called the Apocrypha, and they're from that period of time that generally were not deemed to be in the canon, not part of the Hebrew Bible, but they were added to some Old Testaments and got in there. And so these verses look like they were written at the same period of time, and so therefore they are to be discounted. But it is something to be aware of when you deal with the book of Esther. Now, the last few, any questions on Esther? Again, one of the great books of the Bible. We're gonna split the videos this week because they're two completely different books. Where the last 4 or 5 weeks have all been the same book. So we're going to go ahead and watch the video on Esther.
The book of Esther, it's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And the main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing 2 elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear 2 royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end, they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story, Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral example, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began, why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history, and he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
Now we are going to completely change gears to Job. It's the first of the wisdom books, the way our Bible's organized. And I'll never forget as long as I live. I took a preaching class from Dr. Rummage, and who I love, one of my favorite professors. And it was a preaching through Genesis class. And I had, after my first semester in seminary, gone a year without making a B. And I'm taking that class in January. And the question was, what book can you preach in one sermon? And I didn't answer Job, which was the right answer. And I was one question away from having an A in the class. Started a string of B's, 3 classes in a row, one question on the final kept me from an A. Not that I'm bitter, but I will never forget. It was not Dr. Rummage's fault. I in no way blame him. It just kills me. Anyway, so Job goes a completely different direction. We're a completely different time period. Everything, this is situated between Ezra and Nehemiah. We kind of move through chronologically. Well, now we're in a different section of our Bible, wisdom literature, and so we're back to likely first book actually written for the Bible. The author is anonymous. No way of knowing who it is. Date, nobody really knows for sure. There's no way really of knowing. But it's interesting because of that ambiguity. It really points to the fact that there are suffering believers all the time. And so it is a book that can help in some ways understand suffering better. The key word here is either reject or take back. That's actually the same Hebrew word. Sometimes in the book it's recorded as reject, sometimes it's take back. So same Hebrew word can be translated into 2 different English words. And then the key verse is Job 42, 5 and 6. I had heard rumors about you, but now my eyes have seen you. This is God, Job speaking to God. Therefore I take back my words and repent in dust and ashes. And so at the very end, so just again, at the beginning of the book, God and Satan have a meeting. Satan goes up to heaven, and God's there, and God says, hey, you ever thought about my dude Job? What a good man he is? And basically Satan says, he's only a good man because of how wealthy he is and everything that you give him. Of course he loves you because you give him everything. And then God says, okay, if you do anything to touch him, and they actually let Satan come back later and give him a disease. And so within just a matter of moments, he finds out he lost all of his crops, all of his animals, all of his children. And then begins to mourn that. And then his 3 friends visit him, and that's kind of how the book moves through. And Job throughout, and I remember as a kid always hearing about the patience of Job, and I don't know that patience of Job's a good expression. I don't know that he was overly patient. He never, in all that he did, sinned. But he really wanted to have a conversation with God. And that's what he keeps asking for. I want to see God. I want to talk to God. I want God to explain to me why this is happening. And we'll see that some more as we go through our notes. But that gives you kind of the broad picture of everything that's going to happen to Job. And then he gets restored at the end. Job, you have to be careful because the speeches in Job, which is the majority of the book, are not good theology. In fact, Matt Brunson, who is one of my other short list of pastors I most like to listen to preach, he spent 30-some weeks going through the book of Job, and I'm like, how in the world do you do that when what you're preaching 90% of the time is not good theology? But he's Matt Brunson, he knows how to do it. And it's just a lot of bad stuff in Job, so you have to keep that in mind. These guys that are speaking to Job, especially at the end, have to repent of what they said. And we see Job repenting, but they have to apologize to Job for what they said. So it's really kind of interesting. So a lot of interesting things in the book of Job. Some of the other key stuff that they talk about, the book of Job deals with some of life's most important philosophical questions. How can an all-powerful God allow the righteous to suffer? I mean, that's just, that is a question. If you go to the big 5 questions in philosophy, that's one of them. Is how can a loving God, an all-powerful God, allow the righteous people to suffer. Now, per Norm Geisler, who's was a great apologist. The apologetics is explaining philosophically God, defending God, and 5 perspectives in Job to help understand why bad things happen to good people. So from the author's perspective, suffering is pernicious, so it's satanic. From Job, suffering's a puzzle. He's trying to figure out why all these things happen to him, because he maintains his innocence all the way throughout. So it's serious. We have the friends. Suffering is penal, so sinful. That's what happens at the end. Elihu, one of the most fascinating characters in the Bible, and one where a lot of people disagree on whether he's a good guy, bad guy, or somewhere in between. But Elihu, suffering's purified. It talks about shortcomings, and then God, suffering is providential. It's part of His sovereignty. God, there is no suffering that God does not allow. Does not mean God caused it. God didn't cause Job to suffer, right? Satan's the one that did all that, because Satan has power in this world, but God allowed it. So all suffering is allowed by God, but He does not create. It's like God doesn't create. God cannot be tempted to sin, can't tempt us because He's so holy, and yet we still face temptations. But God allows that to happen. All right. Reasons the authorship is difficult to determine. But so most people would argue he lives about the time of Abraham, or the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac. In that the reason they believe that, a couple of reasons. One, there's a lack of Mosaic references within the book. Nothing in the book talks about Moses. So you would think, if it was somebody writing about after Moses, something about the Moses law, the Sinai covenant, the promise, something be in there. He's also probably not Jewish or Hebrew. Was at the same time as Abraham, so he's certainly not a descendant of Abraham. And then also he was a priest to his family. And so both of those are just a little bit different again. So there's no priest, which tells us we don't have the Sinai laws yet. There's no reference to the tabernacle, the temple, the feasts, or the sacrifices that come from the Mosaic law. He worships, but again, he's his family's priest and has to worship on his own. So none of those laws that you would have, it'd be like when Adam offered a sacrifice or Noah offered a sacrifice. It would just be sacrificing at that time. Places of the name of the book also reflect a setting prior to the conquest of Canaan. The other interesting thing is, Job is the hardest book in the Old Testament to translate into English. There are more unique words. When I say unique, it means it does not appear in any other Old Testament book. There are more unique words in Job than any other book of the Old Testament, and it's not even close. Basically, when you start to learn Hebrew, you learn the words. Hebrew is a 3-consonant language. 90+% of the words are 3 consonants, and they didn't do vowels. That's why it's also hard to interpret sometimes. But they don't do vowels. They do vowel points eventually, but originally there's no vowels. It's just 3 consonants. Every word is 3 consonants, 3 consonants, 3. I mean, it's just what it is. And then every once in a while you get an ending. For the most part, it's 3 consonants all the way through. Job is primarily 2 consonants, which means it was written most likely before the 3-letter words developed. And so that's the other reason it points back to a really early date with Job. I am not going to read the structure and the style of Job because I hate reading to people, and I had somebody tell me last week I was talking too fast. And when I read something this big, I can promise you it's going to be too fast. So I'm going to pass on that. But read that. Take time to read that. It's very interesting. I didn't mean to put that much in there, but I never could find a sentence I wanted to take out. So I said I'm going to copy the whole thing. Fortunately, I didn't have to type it, so there shouldn't be any typos. That is copied. So it should be correct. Then you get the outline, the prologue. Again, explaining the story about how everybody dies. Then there's Job's lament in chapter 3, and then there's the cycle of the speeches, and you'll see more about the cycle of speeches when we look at the video in a few moments. Then in chapter 28, there's this interlude poem of wisdom, and then there's the monologue, so it's single people speaking without the responses. There's Job, and then this is when Elihu pops up. He's not the 3 friends that speak. So Job speaks, and then all 3 respond, and this is kind of the cycle. Well, Elihu is here the whole time. He never says a word until at the very end. And then basically he says, to paraphrase, all right, you bunch of old people, let me tell you what's going on. And as a young person, I know more about this than you do, so y'all need to listen to my wisdom. And it is very much debated on whether Elihu is correct or not. It's just very interesting to hear people debate. A lot of people say Elihu's correct, that's why he doesn't have to repent to Job at the end, so that's why he's correct. But other people say, well, God really never said Elihu was right. So it's just kind of interesting. And after Elihu speaks, Job doesn't respond. God responds finally to Job, which is what Job was asked for at the very beginning. And then Job's reply, and then just a brief epilogue at the end. The one thing about the epilogue, just as a reminder, when you get how wealthy, the other thing is when you talk about how wealthy Job is, it might come up later. Part of it's done because of the sheep, like his wealth is stated in animals. Well, if you see what's destroyed at the beginning, and you look at those numbers and you double them, that's what Job has at the end of the book, with one exception: number of children. The number of children he has at the beginning of the book is the number of children he has at the end of the book. And the implication is he's going to see his children in heaven, and it'll be back to double once he's in heaven with his kids. So just kind of interesting. The kids are the only thing that he doesn't double. Everything else is double. And that's one of the theories of why they think that is. Anyway, that all comes up in the closing narrative. All right, Thea and Stuart. Understanding what the ultimately about through his arrangement. We understand what it's about through his arrangement and content of the various speeches. Two major points. One is the challenge to God by Satan. Now it's really kind of interesting. Satan challenges God, but God really has Satan on trial because he's the one that starts it. But that's the first part. Because Satan says the only reason he loves you is because of what you give him. And then the question the author asks himself, where can wisdom be found? And that's part of that poem of wisdom in the middle of the book. So you just notice the subpoints there as creatures wholly dependent on God for our well-being. Will the godly love God for himself or for his benefits? Do we love God because of who he is? Or do we love God for what he does for us? That's one of the questions we have to wrestle with. As creatures endowed with creaturely wisdom, so we have creaturely wisdom, and the godly willing to live within the bounds of creaturely wisdom, or will they demand to participate as equal gods? Basically, do we understand that we're the creatures and our wisdom is limited and we trust God, or do we try to challenge God? And that's what Job wants to do in this book. He wants to challenge God. Why am I suffering? It's not there. Thus, creaturely dependent, us, and creaturely wisdom are really what's the main one point of the issue. One, there's a question of theodicy. So what's theodicy? How to reconcile undeserved suffering with a God who is both almighty and just. So if God is almighty and God is just, why do we suffer? And I would argue the book does not answer that question. It gives us an answer in Job. One thing to remember in Job, we know that Satan's who created all these things. Job never knows that. In fact, even at the end of the book, there's no indication that Job knows that. Now maybe God eventually revealed it to him, but we get no indication in the book that Job ever understood. Because God basically just said, who are you to question me? Right? Who are you to tell the ocean how far it's going to go? Who are the one to tell the stars where they're going to hang in the sky? Who are you to question my judgment and what I do? And so Job never really, and then Job repents because he goes, you're right, I shouldn't have said anything. I thought the roles in this section were really interesting. Satan plays the role of putting God on trial. Do humans love God again because of what he gives them? That's the question. Job's wife plays the role of Satan, encouraging Job to just curse God and die. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they play the role of conventional wisdom. What they say is conventional wisdom. What people just, conventional wisdom, you know what conventional wisdom is, but just what is it people traditionally, naturally believe. Elihu plays the role, okay, like you can tell where Fee and Stuart fall in the Elihu discussion. Elihu plays the role of the overconfidence of youth who think they are wiser than their elders. Job plays the central role of frustrated enigma. He believes the calamities come from God, so he believes they come from God, yet there's no clear cause and effect. So why did they happen? Why did this happen. And then Yahweh plays the ultimate role. He's the initiator of the story, and he's in charge. Again, you go back, he initiates it. Hey, Satan, what do you think about my guy Job? And so God, God's all-knowing, knows what's going to come out of all of that. And so, again, it demonstrates he's in charge from the beginning. It's like we remember last year when we were going through Jesus on trial with Pilate, and it really is Pilate on trial before Jesus when you look closely at the story. Pilate didn't have the authority, because what did Jesus tell him? You only have authority because my Father gave it to you. So don't act like you're in control of my life. All right, Curley and Phillips, when they get to their themes, it's the idea of an intercessor. Job often asks for a mediator between him and God. So the mediator is an important concept. Timothy deals with that a lot in his book, in the New Testament. But the idea of Jesus is our mediator. He is the one that comes between us and God. Again, no priest at the time, but he instinctively knew. So this is kind of interesting. He has to be his own priest offering sacrifices to God, but yet instinctively Job knew that he needed someone between him and God. So Job, that's why he never sins. He never questions God's authority of what he's doing. He's just questioning why, and he doesn't understand, because conventional wisdom is if you do good, good things happen. If you do bad, bad things happen. And that's not what happened to Job in this book. Purpose of the book, again, why does God allow people to suffer? I would argue, I don't know that it gives a great answer to that question, but it does give, the point is that we are to trust God. We may not understand why we have suffering in our life or what the specific suffering is. What we can do is trust God when the suffering comes. And so we can't answer why, but we know what to do. Theological issues come back to theodicy. Job is a man suffering because he was caught in the middle of a spiritual war between God and Satan. Not because of anything he did. And again, I love this. It's kind of what I touched on before. The book is about God and not Job. And so that's good. Since I banged on Curley and Phillips the last time, I'm glad they put that this time. The book, that's always the deal. That's always the answer. Remember, the book is about God and not whoever you read about. It also, I thought this was interesting, they correlated this very much with the prosperity gospel, and the idea that it really does speak against the prosperity gospel that's very popular in our country today and in Western civilization is this idea is that if I follow God, all these good things are going to happen to me. I'm going to get a better job, my marriage is going to be better, all these things are going to be great, I'm going to make more money, whatever. And that's not the promise of the Bible. And this book very much speaks to that. Now God does. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Some people believe that the epilogue of Job, where he gets everything back, is actually added on later. Because it may not have been, they don't believe necessarily it was part of the original. But there's nothing indicating it's that way. But so God gave him this stuff back, but that's not the point. That's still God's grace. So the prosperity gospel does not point to the fact that when we do good stuff, good things are going to happen to us. He's faithful to his promises, but it is not promising physical returns. Okay, gracious, we'll get into the videos later in our this. All right.
Book of Job. It's a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer, then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by three friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent. And so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, Job, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now, it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of. Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours, it's extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile. But more likely, they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now, this is surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling, how Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God, and that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
Okay. Any questions? Oh, we don't have time for me to do my list. I had good ones tonight. But anyway, let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Dear God, we come before you tonight to praise you as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We thank you for the books of Esther and Job. We thank you that they're so different. And yet, God, tell us about you and help us to just have a different perspective on understanding who you are. Whether it's trusting you when it seems like you're not speaking to us, whether it's trusting you when we go through suffering and difficulties. God, we just want to make sure that we always love and trust you, and we thank you that you allow that, especially through the power of the Holy Spirit. And Lord, pray that you go with us and help us to live righteously and holy before you for your glory. So in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.